All right, Rabbi say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning shiur. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Steve and Teri Czinn, for dedicating all the shiur and drushos this month in loving memory of Steve's father, Bunim Tzvi ben Chaim, on the occasion of his 18th Yahrzeit. Leah Sol, as a zechus for the refuah sheleimah for daughter Ilana bas Esther, and for all the wounded of Eretz Yisroel. To Yonason Rachel Wolff for a complete and lasting refuel sheleimah for Refuel Yitzchak Baruch ben Esther. Jerry and Sora Wolasky in the zechus of refuel sheleimah for their grandsons Zecharya Dov and Perel Shira, and Azriel and Iris Miller in the zechus of the holy soldiers of the IDF, and on the merit of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisroel. Thank our week of learning sponsors, Robert Emas, in commemoration of the Yahrzeit of his mother, Rus bas Sora, and an appreciation for the Daf Yomi shiur. An anonymous sponsor in honor of Yoni Frager's birthday. Yoni Frager's birthday is getting a lot of traction in this year. Mazel tov, mazel tov. And our day of learning sponsors, Yitzchak and Rebecca Statman, Lezecher Nishmas Menucha Shendel Yehudis Bas David Yosef. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD Torah, all of the neshamos have an aliyah, the families have an nechama, all those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Yoni Frager should have an incredible happy birthday. Our holy soldiers of the IDF should have Hashem Bizocha to be successful in all of their missions, and our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisroel should have incredible siyata d'shmaya, koach and gevura miratz Hashem in the days ahead. Well, so with that, let us begin. Our daf today is Samech Ches 68, and we are picking up in miratz Hashem on Samech Zayin Amud Beis. So we left off at Ashkechan Achos Isha, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. So as I remember again, what we were dealing with in the Mishnah, actually a very interesting Mishnah, where the Mishnah broke down marriage into multiple categories and explained that depending specifically on the status of the people involved in the marriage will determine ultimately, again, number one, does the marriage itself work? Is the marriage effective? And number two, what is the impact of the marriage on the offspring? So we're now in category number 4, category number 3, which is that halacha l'maisa, if a man marries a woman who is usher to him, right, who he cannot affect Kiddushin with, but she could affect Kiddushin with someone else, then halacha l'maisa, the offspring is a mamzer. So remember again, we already identified the idea that halacha l'maisa, that's really referring to anyone who's in erva. Anyone who's in erva. So I'll say, so now what we started with yesterday, so again, a man tries to marry any woman who is one of the arayos to him, tries to marry his sister, tries to marry his mother, tries to marry another married woman. So remember again, there's no Kiddushin in any of these cases, and the offspring is a mamzer. Now, interestingly enough, the one case that the Torah identifies in this area ultimately is Achos Isha, wife's sister. So I'll say, so now we're trying to figure out, how do we know this halacha? So the Gemara says, Ashkechan, Achos Isha. So now I find this principle ultimately again by wife's sister. That if you try to marry your wife's sister, A, the Kiddushin doesn't work, and B, the offspring from that union will be a mamzer. Shar arayos minalan. From where do I know other arayos relationships that this is true as well? Number one, that no Kiddushin. And number two, that if that relations with this, that a child from this union produces a mamzer. So the Gemara says, Yafinan me achos isha. We learn it out from achos isha. Ma achos isha miyuchedes shi erva v'chayavin al zadono karis val shigagas achatos v'lo tafsi b'kiddushin. So say essentially, achos isha becomes, wife sister becomes the paradigm. What's unique about wife sister? Number one, she's an erva. Number two, relations with her intentionally carry karis, right? And accidentally is a chatos, a shogig is a chatos, and Kiddushin doesn't take effect. So this becomes the paradigm. Af kol shehu she erva, any case where the relationship is an erva, v'chayavin al zadona kares, and ultimately intentional relations carry with it a kares penalty, val shigagas a chatos, and a shogeg will result in a chatos, lo tafsi ba Kiddushin. So we'll say, so that's the Gemara suggesting that halacha l'maisa, this is the paradigm. So as long as you fit the paradigm of achos isha, namely, it's an erva, intentional violation is kares, unintentional violation is a chatos, and Kiddushin doesn't take effect. So to any forbidden relationship that fits into this paradigm, also Kiddushin won't take effect, and halacha also created mamzer. Fine. So bishlama kulhu osyan ele eishes ish ve'eishes ach ikal mifrach. So we'll say, here's the difference. So fine, most arayos cases could fit into this paradigm. But here's the problem. Two cases, namely again, eishes ish, a married woman, eishes ach, one's brother's wife, ikal mifrach. There's a pircha, there's a problem. What's the problem? Mala achos isha, shekin ein la heter b'makom mitzvah. I will say, there is no situation in which your wife's sister is permitted to you. Right? Now, the truth is, technically, when does she become permitted? Right. But why? She's no longer your wife's sister. In other words, right? So in other words, the Gemara is pointing out over here, in Achos Isha, wife's sister, there is no scenario in which she becomes permitted to you. Yet, Tomar ve'eshazach, your brother's wife, there is a mitzvah, sheyesh lahet of makom mitzvah. Remember again, your brother's wife, halacha l'maisa, there is a situation where ultimately she becomes permitted to you. Eishes ishnami, so to a married woman. This is interesting. What's unique about a married woman? Ikal mifrach, ma lahanach shekin ein laheter bechaye osran. So I will say, in all other situations, in all other araya situations, so ultimately again, the person who is prohibited as an erva is never permitted when the person who makes her an erva is alive, right? However, Tomar be'eshes ish, sheyesh laheter bechaye osran. Yet a married woman, technically speaking, could become permitted during the lifetime of the person who prohibits her. Now, how does that happen? Divorce, right? So right now, again, Rachel is married to Ruvain, so therefore, again, Rachel is an erva onto every other man. Technically speaking, again, Ruvain divorces her, even though Ruvain's still alive, halacha l'maisa, she now becomes permitted. So we're just pointing out over here that whereas we thought that the paradigm of achos isha, of wife's sister, is such a perfect paradigm to learn out that anytime you're an erva, where ultimately, again, intentional violation kares, unintentional violation chatos, Kiddushin doesn't take effect, offspring are mamzerim, so anything that fits, so therefore anything that's an erva, and again has those punishments fit in. We're just pointing out there are cases that are different. Which would then tell us that the paradigm doesn't work. Ella Amr Yona, Vitema Rafuna Breid Rav Yeshua, Amr Kar, the pasuk says, Kol asher yaseh mikol ha'toivos ha'elu v'nichrasu. So Rabbi say the Gemara now suggests the following. The pasuk says, whoever shall go ahead, right? Whoever performs any of these abominable things, ultimately, again, the people involved will suffer kares. And I will say, this is talking about arayos. So what do you see from this pasuk? Hukshu kol ha'arayos kulam la'achos isha. So also you see that all arayos are grouped together, and ultimately, again, compared to the case of wife's sister. Ma achos isha lo tafsi ba kiddushin. Just like a wife's sister, ultimately, again, kiddushin doesn't take effect. Af kol arayos kulam lo tafsi ba kiddushin. So to all other arayos, kiddushin doesn't take effect. Okay, so that's a pretty easy drasha. Ihaki, if that's the case. So it says that's very interesting. Ihaki, top of Sameches, afilu nida nami. So Rabbi say, listen to this. So based on this, so now the paradigm you're creating is as follows. The pasuk says, "Kol asher ye'aseh mikol ha'toivos ha'ila." Whoever goes ahead and performs any of these abominable things, i.e., is involved in an erva relationship, ultimately again punishable by kares. So you see from here that all arayos, all forbidden immoral relations are grouped together, and the Gemara suggests and ultimately compared to achos isha, to wife's sister. And then we go back to what we said before, right? Just like wife's sister, intentional violation kares, unintentional violation chatos, kiddushin doesn't take effect, offspring are mamzerim, that becomes the rule for everything. So any erva falls into that scenario. And again, both say, for our purposes, what are we focused on? For our purposes, you cannot affect kiddushin with an erva. That's the point that's happening over here. You can't affect kiddushin with a woman who is an erva to you. Fine. The Gemara says, well, 1 second. Afilu nida nami. I will say, when a woman is a nida, right, she's an erva. I will say, now just to be clear, that's not just if one's wife is a nida, right? Stam, a woman, right? You have a single man and a single woman, right? And ultimately, again, Reuven and Rachel are not married to each other. Rachel is a nida. When Rachel is a nida, ultimately, again, she is an erva. right? That is a forbidden relationship ultimately to Ruvain, right? Forbidden relationship to Ruvain. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, then you shouldn't be able to affect Kiddushin with a woman who is a nida. Take a look at the top Rashi. Afilu nida nami im kiddush pinuya b'mei nidasa lo lehavel Kiddushin. Right? Ultimately, again, if you try to affect Kiddushin with a woman who is a nida, we're talking about single people right now. Let's say, right, Reuven's marrying Rachel. Very beautiful, wonderful shidduch. Rachel is a nida at the time they're going to get married. B'pashtos, that Kiddushin should not work. Vim ba'ala b'nidas, fine. Vim ba'ala b'nidasa, you have Vlad Mamzrash says. Now, both say, now there's two things the Gemara is bringing up over here. So number one, based on what we just said, is that halacha l'maisa, Kiddushin doesn't take effect in any case of erba. That's number one. And number two, any resulting offspring are mamzerim. So if that's the case, a man should not be able to have Kiddushin, should not be able to marry a woman who is presently a nida. That's number one. And number two, relations with a woman who is a nida, right? The resulting offspring should be a mamzer, based on the paradigm we've established. So the Gemara says, Allah, if that's the case, Allama Amar Abaye. So why did Abaye? So both say Samicha 68a, first line. Amar Abaye, Hakol Moldim Beba'al Anida, V'Avasota, She'ein Havlad Mamzer. Yet Rabbi Abaye says, everyone agrees that if a man has relations with a nida, Rabbi say, to be clear, relations with a woman who is a nida is an offense punishable by kares, right? Yet, halacha l'maisa, the offspring is not a mamzer. The offspring is not a mamzer. So the Gemara says, how do you know this? Amar Chizkiya, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, utihi nidasa alav. Ultimately, I'm going to say, utihi nidasa alav. What does that mean? Afilu b'shas nidasa tehei ba'aviyah. I'm going to say that lashon of tehi is the same lashon of v'haya, which is the lashon of kiddushin. So you see over here that it's hinted to in the pasuk that you could affect kiddushin with a woman who is a nida. So I'll say, so by the way, there's so much to say on this. So first of all, so here's what's interesting, is as much as we set up a paradigm that kiddushin cannot be affected, cannot affect kiddushin with a woman who is an erva, we see an exception to this rule. The exception to this rule is nida, that a man can marry a woman who is a nida. Now, granted, they can't have relations, because relations ultimately, again, are punishable by kares, but halacha l'maisa, kiddushin does work. Why? It's a limud of the pasuk. Utihi nidas alav. Literally, again, her nidos will be upon him. What does that mean? Utihi, tihi is lashon of kiddushin. You can affect kiddushin with a woman who is a nida. And I both say this is important. So two things I just want to comment on this. This is how he paskin, right? You could have what's called the chupas nida. Couple could get married. The woman is a nida. Now again, it has its own complications in that, again, how does the chassan put the ring on the kala's finger without touching her? Because remember, again, physical contact is prohibited when the woman is a nida. And again, you can't have yichud, you can't have real yichud, right? Because again, the only heter to be alone with a woman who's a nida is after a couple has had relations. So it's fraught with some level of halachic, I'm not going to call it difficulty, but halachic technicalities. But halacha l'maisa, we ask him that a man can marry a woman. I want to share with you an incredible Rambam. The Rambam says something amazing. I'm just kind of going to give it to you away a little bit over here because I think it's just fascinating. The Rambam says in Hilchos Ishus Parak Dal Halacha Yud Beis, Hamakadesh achas min ha'arayos lo asa klum she'in kiddushin tovsin la'erva. All right, so I kind of gave you the conclusion already, even though you knew it because the Mishnah said it. You cannot affect kiddushin with a woman who isn't erva. Right? So a man tries to marry a married woman, doesn't work. Man tries to marry his sister, tries to marry his aunt, tries to marry his wife's sister. None of it works. Kiddushin doesn't work. Chutz min hanida. Exception is a nida. Shamakadish es hanida harezu mikudeshes kiddushin gimurin. Ultimately, again, because if you marry a nida, ultimately, again, totally works. But also, listen to the Rambam ends. Ve'ein roi lasos king. The Rambam says you shouldn't do it. Don't get married when the woman is in nida. So I will say there's a lot of rate on this. There's a lot of discussion over here. Exactly like what exactly does this mean? So some argue on this Rambam vociferously, saying, Rambam, where do you get this from? The Maggid Mishnah brings down, he says, the Rambam is saying just on a practical level. On a practical level, the concern is that she'll come to touch her. right? Or worse, come to relations. In other words, that again, a couple's just getting married. Obviously, again, there's intensity of emotion. So the fact that the wife is a nida, again, it seems to feel like it's playing with fire a little bit. Just better to avoid. So again, just pointing out, again, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't bring down that same phrase of Ein Roi Lasos Kain, but it's interesting just to note the Shita, so it works, but halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, better to avoid. Now, I will say, it is interesting to note, I'll just mention this, that why doesn't offspring with a nida produce mamzerim? In other words, it seems to defy the rule, right? A woman who's a nida is an erva. Relations with an erva are prohibited, right? Punishable by kares intentionally, chatas unintentionally, and the offspring is a mamzer. That is the rule. So why doesn't it work this way by nida? So I'll share with you a ridiculously amazing Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch said that ultimately, again, this is an example of chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Let's just be honest for just a moment. Can you imagine what Klal Yisrael would look like if ultimately, again, so offspring from a nida produced mamzerim? So again, for a variety of different reasons, right? People struggle with Taras HaMishpacha, people don't know Taras HaMishpacha, people make mistakes in Taras HaMishpacha. We're human beings. And it affects an area of life, of marital intimacy, which is sometimes such a complicated area. So can you imagine if ultimately, again, relations with a nida produced mamzerim, Rosai? There would be a proliferation. In other words, it would totally wreck the entire genealogical structure of Klal Yisrael. So the Rebbe Shalom knows us. He knows us. He knows our strengths. He knows our weaknesses. He knows the things that we struggle with. And Sefer HaChinuch says, in one of the greatest displays of chesed from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he made this an exception. Now, again, to be clear, relations with a woman who's a nida is a chiyuv kares. Right? Relations with a woman, that's intentionally. Unintentionally, a chiyuv chatos. Right? So again, it is a very, very, very severe prohibition. But that being said, the Ribono Shel Olam also went ahead and kind of put a safeguard for the nitzchis of Klal Yisrael. So I will say, the beauty of this is, what do you see from here? The Ribono Shel Olam is hyper-focused on one thing, and that is the endurance of our people, and the longevity of our people, and the staying power of Klal Yisrael. That's what I see. I say that's where our confidence comes from. Where does Klal Yisrael's confidence, ridiculous confidence, where do we get this confidence and hope and optimism, right? Even in the face of sometimes overwhelming adversity, where do we get it from? So it's interesting. We get it from nida. I know that sounds like you've never heard that one before, right? We get it, meaning we'll say, look what's happening in this halacha. What's happening in this halacha is that Kadosh Baruch Hu says, I've got your back. I am hyper-focused in ensuring that this people survives. I am hyper-focused in ensuring that this people thrives. I'm hyper-focused in making sure that there is continuity for Klal Yisrael, the Netzach Yisrael Shabbosai. When you have the King of Kings essentially changing the rules, that's what he did. He changed the rules, right? The rule is that ultimately, again, offspring with an erva produces mamzerim. That's the rule. In 99.99999% of the time. There's one exception. Where's the exception? In the one case where we would be most prone to produce mamzerim. Isn't that incredible? In the one case where we're most prone to produce mamzerim, that's why Kadosh Baruch Hu says, no mamzerim in that case. No mamzerim in that case. Kadosh Baruch Hu is hyper-focused on our continuity and on our national strength. That's what the Ribono Shel Olam is focused on. If he has to change the halacha to ensure that, we can't change halacha. He'll change the halacha ultimately to ensure that. We'll say this: who would have ever thought that Kiddushin Sameches Amud Aleph, the exception by nida, would ultimately become one of the most incredible and magnificent sources of strength for Klal Yisrael? The Ribono Shel Olam always has our back. The Ribono Shel Olam is always focused on taking care of us. The Ribono Shel Olam has one primary focus in this great universe, which is to ensure the nitzchias, the eternality of Klal Yisrael. And when you know that, Rabbi, you can put your head on the pillow, resting assured that everything will be okay. Because the Melech Malchei Hamlochim is holding your hands every single moment. Incredible, I will say. What a chizik and what an incredible mucker, right? What an incredible source for that chizik. Okay, let's go back there. Says the Gemara as follows. So the Gemara says, Michdi, Ikala Kusha L'nida, Vikala Kusha Achosisha. Says Rabbi Say, it turns out that's what? It turns out that Halacha L'maisa, now we have two sources for Arayos, right? In other words, we almost have like two models. There's Achos Isha model, and then there's the Nida model. What's the Achos Isha model? The Achos Isha model is, right, B'mezid, Kares, B'shogeg, Chatos, no Kiddushin, and Mamzer. Right? That's the Achos Isha. What's the Nida model? Yes, right? Kares, for intentional, right? Chatos, yes Kiddushin, no Mamzerus. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Why are you comparing all other Arayos to Achos Isha? Why don't you do what? Why don't you compare all Arayos to what? To Nida. So the Gemara says, Michti, Ikala Kushla, Nida, Vikala Kusha, La Achos Isha. You could compare all other Arayos ultimately again to Nida or other Arayos to Achos Isha, to wife's sister. My chaz is the makshis lehu la Achos Isha. Why are you comparing it to Achos Isha? Akshel Nida. Go ahead and compare it to Nida. To which the Gemara says, Kula v'chumra, l'chumra makshia. No, because it makes sense. We'll say when it comes to Arayos, when you want to go ahead and halacha l'maisa, right, create a paradigm, it makes sense that for Arayos, your paradigm is going to be l'chumra and not l'kula. Okay, so for Rabbi, it turns out that Nida is not at all the paradigm. Nida is the exception to the paradigm. Okay, so the Gemara says, so remember, we're just trying to figure out one simple thing over here. We're trying to figure out halacha l'maisa. From where do I know that in cases of arayos, kiddushin doesn't take effect and the resulting offspring are mamzerim? Right? That's what I want to know. So we just had Rav Yona. So Rav Yona went ahead and learned it out from, again, essentially all arayos are compared to Achos Isha. Fine. Now we're going to have another approach. There's a kavachomer from Yavama. What's the kavachomer by Yavama? So the Gemara says, Ma Yavama shehi belav lo tavsibu kiddushin. So I'll say ultimately again, by Yavama, ultimately again, she has a lav. Now we'll say, look at Rashi. Asya. Shar rayos bekavachomer mi Yavama l'shuk. She'ein kiddushin tovsid ba kiddu amar Rabbi Yavama. So I will say, the Gemara over here is quoting the opinion of Rav, who says that a woman who is a shomeres yavam. So a woman who is waiting for Yibum, ultimately again, kiddushin from another man, i.e. then from her brother-in-law, does not take effect. Now I will say, a Yavama is only under the penalty of a lav when it comes to another man, right? It's not an Isser Kares, right? It might be quote unquote an it's not really even, well, it's kind of like an erva, but lamaisa again, it's only punishable by a lav. So by Yavama, where it's only punishable by a lav, if another man tries to make kadesher, lo tafsibu kiddushin, the kiddushin doesn't work. We'll say if stam a guy, Rachel is married to Ruvain dies, right, without children. Ruvain has a brother, Shimon. So now Rachel is a shomeres yavam. She's waiting to do yibum. Then what happens? Levi, unrelated guy, comes and gives her kiddushin. People say, what's the halacha? Doesn't work. So this is yet again, this is a lav. So again, there's a prohibition of a lav, yet kiddushin will not work. So chayve misos, chayve krisos, lo kol shekin. So we'll say all the more so, if ultimately again you have a relationship which is punishable by miso or by kares, certainly it will not work. So we'll say, so Rav Bar Yaakov is learning all this stuff from a Kavachomer from Yavama. If that's the case, Shar Chayve Lavin Nami. So we'll say, well, if that's the case, then the truth is you should apply this to other Chayve Lavin and say Kiddushin won't, just like by Yavama, if another man tries to make Kadesher, it won't work, and that's only punishable by a lav. So we'll say, so Rav Bar Yaakov wanted to make a Kavachomer. If Kiddushin is not Tovsin by a lav, it's certainly not what? It's not Tovsin by Kares. So I don't understand. So why don't you just say that just like Kiddushin is not kofsin by a lav, by Yavama, it's also not kofes in any other cases of a lav. So the Gemara says, Amrav Papa chayve lavin behedjik sibu. No, because we'll say by chayve lavin there's another pasuk. What does the pasuk say? Ki siena leish shtei noshim. Pasuk says actually very interesting. If a man will have two wives, ha'achas ahuva, the achas snua. One is beloved and one is despised. I both say, this is Parshas Ki Seitze. So remember again, context. What's the context? The parsha begins with the discussion of the Yifas Torah, the war bride. Now remember again, Kadosh Baruch Hu does not want the Jewish soldier taking a war bride. It's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. But the Torah Keneged Zecharya, okay, we're not going to get into the whole sugya. Afterwards, the Torah speaks out the halachos of inheritance. And the Torah says, if a man has two wives, one who he loves and one who he despises, and the older child is from who? The despised wife. You can't favor the child of the loved wife over the child of the despised wife. So you have to give the older child gets Pishnaim, gets a double portion. So I said, this is a great Gemara. So listen to this. So the Torah says, man has two wives. V'chi yesh snua. V'chi yesh snua lefnei hamakom. V'ahuva lefnei hamakom. So I don't understand, the Gemara says, is there a loved wife and a despised wife before HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Now look at Rashi, this is incredible. V'chi yesh ahuva lefnei hamakom. Klomar, v'chi avasa osin aso shal bal chashuva lefnei hamakom. Lishnos din hanachala b'shvila shehutzrach hakasav lichtov lo yuchal levaker ben ahuva the havel lichtov elakias habachor yakir. He is asking something so amazing. Literally, does the Torah care if a man loves one wife and doesn't love another wife? Like, does that matter? Does that matter? All the Torah needed to say is, who gets double portion? Who gets double portion? The Bechar, the firstborn. You like his mother, you don't like his mother. Who cares? Who cares? I will say, this is such a fascinating statement of, does it matter to the Torah if you love your wife or if you don't love your wife? So I was thinking about this. I mean, I don't know. I think it kind of does, right? I think it matters to the Torah. So I will say, perhaps the Gemara is trying to teach us something amazing. I will say, sometimes in life, the job has to get done. The job has to get done independent of whatever your particular emotional circumstances are. See, a lot of times we kind of like, there's something that has to be accomplished, but yet it often doesn't get accomplished because I'm not feeling it. I'm not engaged. I'm not inspired. I'm not this. I'm not that. Who cares? Who cares? Sometimes when something in life has to get done, your feelings make absolutely no difference. And you just have to do what you have to do. So, and it could be that there's a certain paradigm like that exists in marriage as well, which might sound a little bit strange. A person's in a marriage. I was saying, is every husband and wife always constantly madly in love? So of course, no one ever wants to answer this. Like, yeah, of course, I am all the time. Right? No. Right? There are times there are peaks and valleys in every single marriage. So what do you do in the valleys? And we'll say sometimes it's ahuva and sometimes it's snua. Yes, sometimes it can even descend into snua. So we'll see what the Gemara says. Do you think HaKadosh Baruch Hu cares if it's ahuva or snua? You have a job. You have a job as a husband. You have a job as a wife. Do your job. Fulfill your responsibilities. Rise to the occasion. Do what has to get done for the home, for the family, for the marriage. You're not feeling it? Too bad. Try to figure it out and try to go ahead and plot a course forward. And I both say, and it's not just true in marriage, it's true in life. You know, both say, think about this just a moment. Imagine like our precious soldiers, right? So imagine someone wakes up, right? The soldier wakes up this morning, he's like, you know what? I don't know. I'm just not feeling the whole army thing today. You know, I don't know. Like I'm just not so into it. You know, today really feels much more like a beach day, right? The weather's nice, the sky is blue. Today really feels, it's like, what? Chavra, how many times do we wake up in the morning and say, you know what, today, not feeling the shiur thing. Just not feeling it, right? I don't know, you know, right? Not feeling it, not feeling the night seder thing, not feeling the mincha ma'ariv. Oh no, not feeling it. So what? So what that you're not feeling it? Who said that you have a right to feel it or not feel it? Or who says how you feel makes any difference to anyone? There's a job. There's a job that has to get done. The responsibilities that each of us have. You feel like it, you don't feel like it, it doesn't make a difference. When there's a job that you have, when there are responsibilities that sit on your shoulders, You do what is expected of you. See, Rabosai, when the Gemara says over here, the Gemara is saying sometimes, very often, who cares how you feel? What matters is the responsibilities you have upon you. Execute your responsibilities responsibly. Do what is upon you and don't get caught in the world of emotion or what you feel like. Such an incredible yisod. So Gemara goes back to Ella, so we'll say, let's go back. Okay, but Pashup Shat is still, why does the Torah say ahuva and snua? Ella ahuva b'nisu'eha. Snua b'nisu'eha. It's incredible. We'll say, the Gemara wants to suggest that maybe ahuva and snua actually doesn't mean a beloved wife and a despised wife, but rather it's actually referring to the nature of their marriages. Ahuva means a union that is blessed by God, right? And a snua means a union that is despised by God. So the Gemara says, and yet, what does it say? V'kam rachmana kisiena. And the Torah says it works. I will say, what's an example of a union that is despised by God? A snua? That's a prohibited union. Then I will say, now we know it can't refer to a kares relationship. Why? Why? Because there is no Kiddushin by a kares relationship. So therefore it must refer to what? To a lav. To a lav. And yet, what do you see? V'kam rachmana kisiena. The Torah says kisiena. Remember again, sihiena haya is lashon of what? Kiddushin. So you see from here, I will say that halacha l'maisa, Kiddushin does work. Kiddushin does work with Tovsei Lavin, right? Kiddushin is Tovsei Belavin. Kiddushin does work with unions, with marriages that are punishable by a lav. So the Gemara says, you're right. Rabbi Akiva, Damar in Kiddushin Tovsei Chai Belavin. It'll reflect the view of Rabbi Akiva. So the question is on Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, who holds that ultimately, again, Kiddushin doesn't take effect. Remember, there's a famous sheet of Rabbi Akiva that Kiddushin doesn't take effect by Chai Belavin. Kisiyana b'may mokim. So according to Rabbi Akiva, what is Kisiyana? What is that referring to? What's this snua in that case? Ba'amara l'kohen gadol. Remember again, it's talking about the union of an almana to a widow to a kohen gadol. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Simai. This is Rabbi Simai. Omer minakol hay Rabbi Akiva ose mamzer. Remember Rabbi Akiva's very machmir position that Rabbi Akiva created a mamzer ultimately again through any union. Right? Rabbi Akiva says any prohibited union creates a mamzer. So the Gemara says, chutz mi almana l'kohen gadol. The exception to Rabbi Akiva's own rule was an almana to a kohen gadol. Shahari amra Torah lo yechalal. The Torah says he shall not profane. Chilulim oseh ve'ein oseh mamzeres. So Rabbi Akiva, like Rabbi Simai, or Rabbi Simai explained Rabbi Akiva, that Allah Chaimais is very interesting. Even though Rabbi Akiva normally goes ahead and creates a mamzer, ultimately again from Chayvei Lavin, the exception is an almana to a kohen gadol. Rabbi Yishavev da'amar bol ben Etzavach al Akiva ben Yosef. Shaya Omer kol she'in lo bia b'Yisrael vlad mamzer. And about according to Rabbi Yishavev, who really attacked Rabbi Akiva, said, Rabbi Akiva, what are you doing? Rabbi Akiva, you're going to make so many mamzerim ultimately again because every prohibited marriage, even through a law, produces mamzerus. So Rabbi says, Hanich Rabbi Yishavev. Ila fuki ben Rabbi Simai kasi shaper. So according to Rabbi Shavev, if it comes to exclude the position of Rabbi Simai, it makes sense. But if he's just coming to espouse his own opinion, afilu chayve asay. Ultimately, again, even a marriage punishable by an asay perhaps should be included in this. So my mokim, now what do you establish the case? So the ba'ula l'kohen gadol, talking about the case of a ba'ula. We'll say ba'ula is a woman who is not a virgin marrying a kohen gadol. Maishna, why is it different? The habile asay she'in shava bakol. Because we'll say the case of a ba'ula kohen gadol, the idea that a kohen gadol has to marry a basula, it is an example of a prohibition or an asay that or is actually a positive commandment that doesn't apply to everyone else. In other words, Rabbi say, because remember, uniquely enough, the concept of a basula is only a din by one man, i.e. the kohen gadol. No one else has that particular halacha. The Rabbanan will say, Admukila b'chayvei lavin, nukma b'chayvei asay. Instead of setting up the case as talking about a marriage of chayvei lavin, ultimately, again, set it up as chayvei asay. Again, relationships prohibited by a positive commandment. Hani chayvei asay b'mayninu. So we'll say, what's the case of chayvei asay? Ishtehen. So we'll say, remember again, we're just trying to figure out in the Torah, if we go with the approach, that when the Torah speaks about ha'achas ahuva v'achas snua, one woman is beloved and one woman is despised, it's not talking about the nature of the relationship with the husband, but rather what is it talking about? It's talking about the nature of the marriage. The nature of the marriage. One marriage is beloved, i.e. a halachically proper marriage, and one marriage is despised, i.e. a halachically inappropriate marriage. So we're trying to figure out what are the cases. Samarna wants to suggest as follows. Maybe We're talking about chai ve'aseh. Chai ve'aseh means ultimately unions which are prohibited through a positive commandment. The Gemara says, what's the case? Ishtei misrios. So we'll say, if you're talking about a man who's married to 2 Egyptian converts, so if that's the case, shtei and snuo. So we'll say that's prohibited. Remember again, you can't marry an Egyptian convert. When could the Egyptian converts marry into the General Assembly of the Jewish people? 3rd generation. Say if you're talking about a guy who's married to 2 Egyptian converts, then lemais again, both are quote unquote snuos. Achas mitzris va'achas Yisraelis. If one of them is a mitzris and one of them is Yisraelis, then shtei nashim me'am echad ba'ina. Here's the problem. We'll say there has to be some symmetry in the unions, right? In other words, when it says achasu va'achas snua, there has to be some symmetry in the 2 unions. And ultimately, again, if one of them is a mitzvah, one of them is Israelis, that's 2 from 2 different nations. So the Gemara says, so you need it. If it's about a case of a woman who is not a basula marrying a kohen gadol, miksiv sihiyana lekohen. Does the pasuk say they could be married? Rabbi Akiva bal karchi shavki lekra davidachik umuke nafshe. Rabbi Akiva, therefore, it turns out that according to Rabbi Akiva won't dash in this pasuk. Rabbi Akiva to dash in this pasuk of achas ahuva achas nua is too complicated, and therefore again he just chooses his own drasha. So we'll say, okay, so bottom line, what are we taking from over here? So we'll say, so this is just, remember, we're on a simple mission. This simple mission ultimately is to figure out from where do we know that Kiddushin is not tofsin by any erva situation. And if a man does have offspring with an erva, ultimately again it is araya. So we'll say, so bottom line, halacha myself, what we see is either number 1, a kal v'chomer to achos isha, number 2, a comparison to achos isha, or number 3, a kal v'chomer to yevama. That just like Yevama is only punishable ultimately by Allah, yet Kiddushin is not tofsin by her. So by any other relationship where where relations is punishable by kares, certainly Kiddushin won't be tofsin. Okay, we'll say here's the good news. Everyone is agreeing on the result, right? The result is you cannot affect Kiddushin with a woman whose relationship with you is prohibited by kares, right, or by chatos, right? And if you do, so Kiddushin won't work. We just saw that in the Rambam. And if you try, and again, an offspring will ultimately again be mamzerim. So everyone is agreeing on the result or on the conclusion. 3-way machlokes as to how we learn that particular halacha. Beautiful. Let's go back there. Says v'chomisha ein alav. So let's remember again, 4th category in the Mishnah. Last category in the Mishnah was a woman with whom there is no kiddushin for anyone. No kiddushin for anyone. So what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, so remember again, there's no kares, but halacha l'maisa, again, the status of the offspring follows the mother. So Rabbi said, the Gemara, so what's the example of this? Essentially, either a shifcha kinanis or a non-Jewish woman. A non-Jewish woman. So a man has relations with a non-Jewish woman, no kiddushin, obviously, no kiddushin, no kares either, but no kiddushin. And again, the status of the offspring determined by her. So the Gemara says, how do we know this? So the Gemara says, shifcha kinanis minalan. From where do we know that this halacha applies to shifcha kinanis? Amar Rav Huna, Amar Kra, shvu lachem poem achamar, im adome lechamar. Okay, so let's give a little explanation over here. I just want to say, so remember again, this is by the Akedah. So Avram Avinu says, Shulachan tells, stay here with the donkey. And both say, the Gemara understands the donkey being referenced is Eliezer. That Avram Avinu was making a status statement that Eliezer genealogically had a different status than everyone else. The way that is the same way that a chamar, an animal, doesn't have genealogical status, so too again, the nations of the world don't have genealogical status vis-a-vis the Jewish people, which means again, that if a Jew marries a Gentile, so by definition, again, now this is about a Jewish man marrying even having offspring with a non-Jewish woman, so that the genealogy ultimately again is not connected to the Jewish father at all. And therefore again, that offspring will be completely and fully under the umbrella, the genealogical umbrella of the mother. What's the genealogical umbrella of the mother? Vis-a-vis us, vis-a-vis Klal Yisrael, nothing. One of the nations of the world, ultimately, again, not part of our genealogy. The way the Gemara chooses to express it is the same way that a chamor, that a donkey, that an animal doesn't have any genealogical connection to Klal Yisrael. So ultimately, again, the nations of the world have no genealogical connection to Am Yisrael as well. So the Gemara says, Ashkechan v'lo tafsi b'Kiddushin. So now I understand, so actually we skipped that a little bit. I understand now that you can't affect Kiddushin, right? So therefore, again, if a Jewish man tries to marry a non-Jewish woman, there's no Kiddushin in that. So the Gemara says, Amud Beis, Vlada kamosa minalan. Right? Ultimately, again, how do I know that the offspring follows the mother? Right? So there's two pieces over here. The idea, ultimately, again, that I can't go ahead, that a Jewish man can't go ahead and affect Kiddushin ultimately with a non-Jewish woman. Where do I know that from? Because they're both say, again, on a genealogical level, so the non-Jew is compared ultimately, again, to the donkey. Again, not calling the non-Jew a donkey, but ultimately seeing on a genealogical level. The same way that ultimately, again, the chamor has no genealogical connection to the Jew, so the nations of the world have no genealogical connection to the Jew. So again, if there's no familial connection, you can't have Kiddushin. How do I know also that if they do have relations and there's offspring, that ultimately, again, the identity of the offspring follows the Gentile mother? Amar Kra, Ha'isha v'yiladet yel adonel. Ultimately, the pasuk says the maidservant and her offspring ultimately, again, will belong to the master. Will belong to the master. Now, both say, now remember, this is talking dafka by shifcha kinanis. Right, by a non-Jewish maidservant. So that's why the Gemara was pointing out. The Gemara says shifcha kinanis minolan, because one of the examples that the Mishnah gave was a non-Jewish maidservant. So both say, so now when it comes to a non-Jewish maidservant, I know two things. Number one, Kiddushin doesn't work, right? And ultimately, again, the offspring is misyaches, is genealogically under the umbrella of the Gentile mother. So I know those two things now. That's shifcha kinanis. Nachris minolan. We'll say, what about a stam non-Jewish woman? Stam non-Jewish woman. So again, not a shifcha kinanis, right? But ultimately, again, a non-Jewish woman. How do I know that if a Jewish man tries to marry a non-Jewish woman, that there's no kiddushin, there's no concept of kiddushin in this context? Amakra lo tischatein bam. The pasuk says, "You shall not marry them." You shall not marry them. The say, who's the them? Now, actually, we're going to see ultimately again that them are actually the nations of Canaan. But the idea over here is this is not a shifcha case, these are Gentile nations. You cannot marry into the Gentile nations. Lo tischatein bam. That's it. So what the Gemara says? Now, Rashi points out, Lo teheilucha bam Torah schitun. The institution of marriage doesn't apply to them. In other words, I want to be clear. B'nai Noach, right, halachically, B'nai Noach have a concept of marriage. What it's saying is the concept of marriage doesn't apply between Jew and non-Jew. There's no construct of marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew. So the Gemara says, Ashkechinu d'lo tafsi b'Kiddushin. So now I know ultimately again that there's no Kiddushin. So the Gemara says, Vlada kamosa minalan. How do I know that if they do have relations, and ultimately again there's offspring, that the offspring follows the mother, the Gentile mother? How do I know that? So Rabbi So we'll say this is fascinating. Now the context over here is actually the previous pasuk is lo tischatein bam, do not marry them, do not marry into the nations of the world. Bitcha lo sitein limno, do not give your daughter to his son, which means don't allow your daughter to intermarry. Ubito lo sikach livnecha, and do not take his daughter, i.e. the Gentile daughter, for your son. After that, the pasuk says, Ki yasir es bincha me'acharai. Because again, if your son marries a non-Jewish woman, ultimately again, she will turn his heart, ultimately again, away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what's going to happen. Ki yasir es bincha me'acharai. Bincha, habami Yisrael es kari bincha. Shabbos says, it's interesting. Even once your son marries, even if a person's son marries a non-Jewish woman, the Torah still calls him what? Bincha, your son. Which there's a lot to say there also. That sometimes in life, sometimes in life, our children don't do what they want. Don't do what we want them to do. You're like, sometimes our children don't do what we want them to do. Let's say, it's always important. One of the most important things in a relationship between a parent and a child is a child always has to know that there's a sense of unconditional love. It's much harder sometimes for a father than it is for a mother, right? But Lamaisa, there are all of us experience moments where maybe we're not proud of our children, for a variety of different reasons. so important that we try to keep that inside, and maybe they don't see that. A son always has to know that he has a place in his father's heart, no matter how many wrong turns he makes in life. After all, again, isn't that what we want from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? I'm a son of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I do so many things to disappoint my father every single day. And what do I want? I just want to know that he loves me, and I just want to know that he's proud of me, no matter how many times I disappoint him. So if that's what I want from my father, then I have to make sure that that's the same thing I give to my kids. If I give that to my children, then my father will give that to me. So the Gemara says, you see from here that ultimately, again, your son is still called your son. Right? Why? Because your son came from a Jewish woman. He says, Bincha ba Yisrael is kari bincha. Ultimately, again, your son who comes from a Jewish woman is ultimately called your son. Ve'in bincha ba min ha'avaydas kochavim kari bincha. But a child you have with a non-Jewish woman, he's not called your son. So we'll say that's how we're learning out. So it's two things we're learning out of here. Number one, there is no Kiddushin. There is no Kiddushin with a non-Jewish woman. And number two, ultimately the offspring that comes from that woman, that offspring is not yours. That offspring ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, goes after her. It's only called bincha when it's a child who comes from a Jewish woman. But if it's a child that comes from a non-Jewish woman, that's her son, not your son. Ella b'no. Amra b'no shema b'no. What do you see from here? Ben bitcha haba mina ovid kochavim karoi bincha. I'll say what you see from here is something very interesting, which is the son of your daughter, who comes from a Gentile father, is still called your son. Right? In other words, why? Jewish mother. Right? Jewish mother. Any child that comes from a Jewish mother, ultimately, again, is still called your son, is still called a Jew, is still called a Yid. Now, again, so we'll see. So what does Ravina hold? So we'll say maybe Ravina holds, now listen to this, that ultimately a non-Jew or an Eved who fathers a child with a Jewish woman, although the child is Jewish, because it's coming from a Jewish mother, ultimately, again, the offspring is mamzer. Offspring is a mamzer. Where it says, whoa, where do you get that from? Nihid de kasher lo havi. No, even though the child might not be kasher, we'll see what that means in just a moment. Lo havi, lo havi, mamzer lo havi, pasal mikri. Ultimately, I will say, even though the Gemara essentially says that the child that comes from a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father is not going to be a mamzer. What is Rabbi saying? It's pasal. Now, the truth is, we don't have too much time to really get into this, but this is actually interesting. What is the status? So I'll say, I just want to point out what like such a solistic Gemaras we're learning over here today, right? The concept of intermarriage. How do we know that halacha l'maisa again? First of all, it's interesting that technically speaking, there's no such thing on a halachic level, on a legal level, as intermarriage, right? Why is there no such thing? Because there's no such thing as marriage when it comes to a Jew and a non-Jew. That construct ultimately, again, doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. So I will say, so that's number one. Number two, halacha l'maisa, that we've established. Number two, we've established that if a Jew has offspring with a non-Jewish woman, that offspring follows her, right? Why? Again, ki yasir is bincha. Your son is only a son when it comes from a Jewish woman. If it doesn't come from a Jewish woman, ultimately, again, that's not your son, that's her son. That was, interestingly enough, so now we establish that offspring that comes from a Jewish mother, even halacha l'maisa, if the father is not Jewish, the offspring is still Jewish. So the Gemara wanted to say, maybe the offspring is a mamzer. No, the offspring is not a mamzer. Rather, again, the offspring ultimately, again, is the Gemara says, is pasal. Now, what's the impact of being pasal? So we'll say pasal is not a mamzer. So what's interesting is you see that the child who is the offspring, ultimately again of a non-Jewish father and a Jewish woman, is 100% Jewish, but there is some level of genealogical impact. So, for example, again, if it was a girl, that girl would not marry a Kohen. Now again, there's a discussion again about if it's a boy, what the impact on him is, but just again, suffice it to say that halacha l'maisa, even though the child is 100% genealogically Jewish, there is some level of genealogical impact as a result of this union. Incredible. So one says, hahu, but here's the problem, we'll say. The pasuk of lo tischatin bam, don't marry into them, which we're using as the source for intermarriage, that's actually specifically written about the 7 nations. I mentioned this before, right? In other words, that's a specific prohibition for a Jew not to marry into the 7 nations of Canaan, right? So the Gemara says, "Lo tischa hahu b'sheva gaim sid shar umos minalan How do I know about other nations? I was about to say, how do I know that the prohibition of intermarriage, the biblical prohibition of intermarriage, applies to all Gentile nations, not just the seven that are indigenous to Canaan. So the pasuk says, "Ki yasser es bincha." The pasuk says, essentially, do not allow your son to marry anyone who is going to cause him to veer. Cause him to veer. L'rabos kol hamasirim. The pasuk said this comes to include anyone who would cause your child to veer. So in other words, who does that apply to? Any Gentile. Right? So allowing my child to marry anyone who's non-Jewish ultimately, again, creates the potential, ultimately, of chas v'shalom, causing the Jewish child to go off the derech. Hani chal Rabbi Shimon, the derech time of the krah. So I will say, so here's what's interesting. So I will say, so I just want to point out what's happening over here, because it's actually quite riveting. So what's happening over here? So we'll say, so I have, what's the makar, right? What's the source ultimately again what's the source for prohibition of intermarriage? Lo tischatein bam. Do not marry them. The Gemara says, once again, who's the them? I will say, who's the them in the pasuk? Who's the them? The 7 nations of Canaan. How do I know that the prohibition applies to everyone else? So the Gemara says, because the pasuk says, ki yasras bincha. Do not marry the 7 nations. Why? Because ultimately, if you allow your son to marry one of their daughters, the daughter will cause your son to leave HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you see from here, it refers to any marriage which could cause spiritual alienation. So therefore, again, any marriage to a non-Jewish woman which could cause spiritual alienation ultimately is prohibited. The Gemara says, listen to this, Rabbi. That's fine. This makes sense for Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Darshan's time is Rabbi said there's a fundamental machlokes. When you look at mitzvos, or for that matter, again, prohibitions, ultimately, again, do we look at the reasoning behind things or not? Do we look at the reasoning behind things or not? That's the fundamental question. So the Gemara says, so this has to do, again, the makar for this we'll leave on the side. So Rabbi Shimon says, we look at the reasoning for psukim. Now, both say, if you look at the reasoning for psukim, then beautiful. Then the reasoning, ultimately, again, why a Jew can't marry into one of the 7 nations is why? Spiritual alienation. In which case, any marriage which could result in spiritual alienation will be prohibited, even if it's not to a woman of one of the 7 nations. So the Gemara says, El Rabbanan, my time. But according to the Rabbanan who don't darshan the reasoning for a pasuk. So again, the pasuk only refers to marrying into the 7 nations. How do I know that a Jew also can't marry any Gentile woman? Amrakra, the Achakin, Tavo Aleu Baalta. So I will say the pasuk says, ultimately again, this once again by Yifastar, by the war bride. The Torah says after you go through the whole process, then he's permitted to live with her. So the Gemara says, Michlad de Meikara lo tafsi ba Kiddushin. Now I will say, here's what's interesting. It makes it sound like by Yifastar, by the war bride, that halacha l'maisa, Kiddushin only takes effect when? After you go through the whole process of Yifas Toar. But when you initially bring her to your home, ultimately there is no Kiddushin. Kiddushin only takes effect at a later time. So quite amazing. So Ashkechan lo tafsi ba Kiddushin. So now we've established that halacha l'maisa, Kiddushin doesn't take effect with any Gentile woman, be it from the 7 nations or anyone else. So the Rebbe say it's interesting. So now the makar, the source is going to be Yifas Toar. Yifas Toar, she only becomes your wife. You can only marry her after the whole process, which indicates to us what? Before the process, what? She's not your wife, which shows you Kiddushin doesn't take effect with any non-Jewish woman. Vlada minolan. But once again, Vlada kamos minolan. How do I know that the offspring follows the status of the mother, not just by the 7 nations, but by other Gentile women as well? So we're going to stop over here for today. So I'm leaving you mid-thought. We'll stop here for today. We'll say, so again, very exciting and riveting and transformative Gemara. And Me'atzah Hashem to be continued tomorrow. We'll say, Shemen Dishkai.